Welcome to Breads. We've mentioned a number of topics related to bread before, such as the gluten network, leavening, and the contribution of starch granules to structure, but now we're going to focus on these in greater detail. Let's get started. While we eat a variety of different grains, they're not particularly appetizing in their raw form. That is, they tend not to have much flavor as a whole, uncooked seed. Instead, we tend to grind them up and then bake them into something such as bread. Now, we'll often add additional ingredients such as sugar, fruits, or spices to add to the flavor, but even without these extra flavorings, the baked bread is still substantially tastier than the raw grain. While baking grain into bread involves quite a bit of chemistry, it's quite easy to do, and so it became common in nearly every society fairly early on. In fact, bread itself is so synonymous with food that we use it in a variety of different religious rituals. For example, in matzo, in communion, and even wedding cake started out as essentially a sweetened bread. Bread is also ingrained into the etymology of our words. Companion and company derive from the Latin word companio, which means one who shares bread. This originates from the idea that if I am trying to show you that I am a friend, I will share my food with you and hope that you do the same with me in return. In contrast, if I view you as my enemy, I'm not going to share my food with you. In this way, the phrase breaking bread means that we're sharing food and therefore on friendly terms. As I mentioned earlier, we began breaking bread a very long time ago. Prehistoric grains were originally cooked in water to form a porridge, somewhat similar to oatmeal. But we found that we could crush the grain between some rocks and then add some water to form a thick paste. If we then spread the paste on a flat rock that we had heated in a fire, we could bake a flat bread. The heat from the stone turned the paste into a flexible solid that was easier to pick up and eat. Furthermore, the heat caused a variety of chemical reactions that improved the flavor. I'm going to go off on a tangent for a moment about cooking things with fire. The chemical reactions that occur when we cook a food serve to begin breaking down the large molecules such as proteins and starches into smaller ones such as amino acids and simple sugars that are easier to digest. So when we began to use fire to cook, we effectively were able to outsource some of the work of digestion. This increased the number of calories we got from our food while also reducing the caloric investment we had to put into digestion. Because we didn't have to do as much chewing of raw foods, this allowed us to evolve smaller mouths with weaker jaw muscles. As an example, you see here X-ray images of a chimpanzee skull on the left and a human skull on the right. The chimpanzee is our closest living relative in the primate family. Notice how much larger the chimpanzee mouth is compared to the human mouth, and particularly the bottom jaw. This large bottom jaw requires lots of strong muscle to continuously chew food, and these strong muscles require similarly strong attachment points on the skull in order to exert such force onto the jawbone. These strong attachment points require forming longer and thicker bone in that point on the skull. Notice that just above the rear end of the lower jaw is a thicker portion of the skull on both images, but the chimpanzee skull has a substantially thicker ridge here, as denoted by the brighter white color. The reduction in size of our mouths and jaw muscles opens up some additional space in our skulls for a larger brain. Furthermore, the increased nutritional value of our cooked food allowed us to devote a larger fraction of our now higher caloric intake to running this larger brain. So it's no exaggeration to say that the use of fire for cooking is truly man's most important invention. Okay, back onto the topic of bread. We found that instead of cooking the paste into a flatbread, if we allowed the paste to sit around for a few days, it would ferment and inflate with gases. If we then cooked this leavened dough in an oven, allowing heat to enter the dough from all sides instead of just the bottom, as would be the case on a hot stone, we would get a much lighter, more delicate, and more flavorful loaf of bread. The yeasts that fermented these early breads arose spontaneously because air carries numerous yeast spores which would naturally have been incorporated into the dough. Over time, we eventually found that we could intentionally seed a batch of dough with leftover pieces of our previous batch of dough or even from yeast grown in the process of brewing beer. Either way, with this more controlled incorporation of yeast, we were able to better control the fermentation process and get more consistent results out of our bread. We've been talking about incorporating grains into bread for a while now. So let's pause for a moment and examine the grain itself. The raw seed is protected by the outer bran, a tough, fiber-rich layer that contains vitamin B and other trace minerals, along with the majority of the pigment that gives the seed its color. The majority of the interior is occupied by the endosperm, which serves as a storage area for the carbohydrates and proteins that the growing seed will need for energy and for building the structure of its cells. Inside the endosperm is the germ, a small, nutrient-rich core containing a variety of other nutrients and fats that the seed will need to grow. In the milling process, we often remove the bran and germ from the endosperm that makes up the flour. The resulting flour is called white flour because we've removed the pigment molecules along with the bran. However, in recent years, we've begun using more whole grain flours, which do not remove the bran and the germ before grinding, and therefore retain additional nutrients as compared to the white flours. The bran on the outside of the grain makes it hard and bland. All that fiber is tough and strong, but as we saw with the large starches, those long fiber molecules won't fit onto our taste buds. As a result, the outside of the grain isn't very tasty. When we break open the bran and mix the entire grain together, the tastier molecules in the endosperm and germ can now get to our tongues, and so it's significantly tastier. However, breaking through the bran with our teeth isn't very easy. You've discovered this for yourself if you've ever tried to chew into an unpopped kernel of popcorn. They're surprisingly hard to bite into. So instead of using our teeth, we began breaking open the grains using rocks. We started using a mortar and pestle. The grains would be placed into the bowl-shaped mortar and then ground using the pestle effectively as a club to smash the grains between the two rock surfaces. But the repetitive motion of using a mortar and pestle is hard work, and the batch size is relatively small, so we eventually moved to using 2 flat stones. Flat stones were used in a variety of different configurations. They likely started with just a smaller, flattish rock on top of a larger, flattish rock, but we eventually added handles, either made from wooden sticks or carved from the rock itself. Eventually, we began carving notches into the stone surface to increase the efficiency and inclining the stone so that the ground flour would fall off the stone, freeing up space to add more grain. But even this process is quite labor-intensive, so we eventually moved to using large stones that rotated continuously. One configuration had the stone rolling around a central pillar on a raised stone surface. The mill worker would throw the grain onto the raised surface, and the weight of the rolling stone would crush the grain, and it would fall off the raised portion onto the larger, bowl-like surface below. In another configuration, a large, circular stone would be placed on top of another. As the top stone was rotated, grain would be thrown into the center hole, and then slowly ground up until it made its way to the outer edge, where it would fall off onto the floor. While these large stones improved the efficiency, it was still hard work to turn them. Because we're lazy, we turned to other energy sources such as horses or other animals, water wheels, and windmills. For a very long time, the bread that most people ate was still rather plain. But during the Middle Ages, bread became much more specialized. With improvements in milling technology, flours became whiter and more consistent. Flatbreads were used as a trencher, effectively a plate or shallow bowl, that could be eaten out of, and then the trencher itself could be eaten or given away to those less fortunate. And breads came to be used as edible protective wrappings, especially for meats. In this way, bread served a function similar to aluminum foil or plastic wrap today, allowing the meat to be cooked and then protected for a few hours before being consumed, similar to how you might carry your lunch to work today. In the late medieval and Renaissance periods, pastries became more common and foods like beef Wellington, cakes, and cookies were invented. Note, however, that by more common, I really mean more common for the wealthy. If you were a peasant, you were likely unable to afford such expensive luxuries as sugar. Now let's turn to the ovens in which we would cook our bread. As we mentioned earlier, the earliest ovens weren't really ovens at all, but rather a flat rock heated by an open fire. But we found we could bake bread more consistently with an enclosed mud oven. Eventually, we began making more permanent ovens out of stones and bricks. We even began moving the ovens inside our buildings, providing us with heat in addition to baking our bread. However, note that all of these ovens were either temporary, as our nomadic settlements were moved too often to have it be worthwhile to build a better oven, or they were communal or domestic. That is, individuals would cook their bread in the oven shared by the community, or, for the more wealthy, they might have their own oven that they cooked bread in, or that they had a servant cook bread in. But there were no professional bakers that sold bread for money. Everyone baked bread for themselves or their family. It's not until the Industrial Revolution that cities become dense enough to support a professional bakery. For the first time, professional ovens and professional bakers produced the majority of bread consumed, at least within the city. In rural areas, the bread would still have been baked by the populace themselves. As bakers competed for customers, they began adding to their flour various whiteners for a more pure, white look, as well as various fillers such as chalk or ground animal bone to reduce their costs. Until the first American cookbook, American Cookery by Amelia Simmons in 1796, virtually all breads were leavened biologically using yeast, or they went unleavened. Simmons used pearl ash to leaven her bread. Pearl ash is purified ash from burned plant materials, most of which would have been potassium carbonate. Note that the carbonate in potassium carbonate is the same as the carbonate in sodium bicarbonate that makes up baking soda. Between 1830 and 1850, baking soda and baking powder began being produced, and their use became more popular with cooks in order to leaven baked goods much faster than yeasts could leaven. And for the first time, it became possible to leaven thin batter foods like pancakes that we discussed in the previous video. As industrialization continued into the 20th century, incomes rose and people started eating less bread and more meat and high sugar, high fat pastries and cakes. Fewer and fewer people were baking their own bread in their home or even buying it from their local baker. Instead, bread was being baked on an industrial scale in large factories. To minimize the time required to bake a loaf of bread and thus minimize the cost, biological leavening was replaced with chemical leavening. And ingredients were added that allowed the bread to stay soft for a week or more inside a plastic bag. This allowed additional transport time, so the bread could be baked in fewer factories that served a larger area, further improving the economy of scale. This industrially produced bread is very soft, both inside and out. In fact, it resembles cake more than bread, with how soft both the crust, that is the outer edges, and the crumb, the interior, are. Contrast the texture of a slice of white bread with the more traditionally prepared yeast-risen loaf on the right, with its very crunchy crust and chewy crumb. But starting in the 1980s, baking bread using the less refined whole grains has become more popular. Bread machines allow a relatively unskilled individual to produce a loaf of bread as easily as dumping in the ingredients and pushing a button. We've also seen a rise in popularity of so-called artesian breads, with additional flavor largely by returning to the yeast-leavened doughs from the past. Let's now turn to the chemistry that provides the dough its structure on the molecular scale. At its heart, bread dough is composed of water, gluten proteins from the flour, and starches from the flour. However, if we don't separate the mass of gluten proteins, starches, and water, we'll get the thick texture of pasta. In order to get the lighter texture of bread or cake, we need to add lots of tiny bubbles to separate the proteins and the starches. That is, we need to leaven the dough. If the proteins and starches are arranged into many thin layers separated by layers of fat, we get the flaky texture of pastries. This occurs because the fats don't bind to the proteins and starches, so the layers of protein and starch separate like sheets of paper. Within the sheet, there is a strong structure, but between neighboring sheets, the bonds are weak. We can create this type of structure by rolling out the dough into a large flat sheet, then rolling a layer of butter on top. If we then fold the two layers over and roll them out so that they're thinner, fold again and roll, and fold again and roll, and so on, we can create a series of quite thin layers of protein and starch alternating with layers of fatty butter. After baking, these layers will separate quite easily to give us the flaky pastry. Before baking, the water in the dough is bound to the surfaces of the gluten proteins and the starch particles. This forms a semi-solid structure that can be formed by hand and will hold a three-dimensional shape at least for a few minutes. During baking, some of the water evaporates and the rest of the water is absorbed by the starch granules. The absorption of water causes the starches to swell up and form a permanent, solid structure. This then holds the shape of the loaf for longer than the few minutes the dough would have held its shape for. We've talked a bit before about how proteins are made up of amino acids. Those amino acids are monomers that linked together to form the polymers that we call proteins. In eukaryotes, basically every living cell other than bacteria, there are 21 amino acids. These 21 amino acids make up the wide variety of different proteins, similar to how the 26 letters in the English language can make up millions of different words. I've shown the structure of all 21 amino acids here on the right. There are two groups common to all of these structures. In each molecule, there is an amine group, an NH2 group, and in each molecule, there is a carboxylic acid, an atom doubly bonded to one oxygen and singly bonded to another oxygen that has a hydrogen bound to it. In the structures shown here, the carboxylic acid is at the top end of the molecule, and the amine is somewhere along that right side. Note that the amine and carboxylic acid together give us the name of amino acid. Of the 21 amino acids, the human body can make 12, and we call these the non-essential amino acids. The other 9 amino acids you must consume in the food that you eat, and these 9 are termed the essential amino acids. Now, a reasonably varied diet composed of a variety of meats and vegetables will have plenty of these 9 essential amino acids. But if you choose not to eat meat, so you're a vegetarian or vegan, you'll need to be careful to eat a variety of different foods that are high in protein to ensure that you get enough of these 9 essential amino acids. Failing to do so can cause serious malnutrition. Note here that I don't mean to say that you shouldn't choose to be a vegan or vegetarian, as that's not really my place. Rather, I simply urge caution to make sure that you keep your diet sufficiently varied and don't rely on just a single high-protein food. So what exactly is gluten? Gluten is a mixture of a few different proteins present in wheat. The two major components are glutenin and gliadin. Each of these is about 1,000 amino acids long. Glutenin has these amino acids arranged in a long chain shown here as long blue lines. On the other hand, gliadin is folded up into a roughly spherical shape shown here as red circles. Now, each of these forms loose bonds with neighboring proteins, and so when we add water, those loose bonds will be broken, and the proteins can slowly slide past one another. Now, what I mean by the bonds can be broken and the proteins can slide past one another is not that the proteins no longer have chemical bonds linking them to their nearest neighbors. Rather, the bonds are constantly breaking and forming, such that the proteins can slowly slide past one another as some bonds are broken and new bonds are formed slightly farther along the neighboring protein. In a similar way, you might make your way through a crowded party, stopping periodically to exchange pleasantries with your neighbor before moving on. You're forming temporary bonds with your neighbor during the short conversation, and then breaking those bonds to continue making your way through the crowd. The forming and breaking of these loose bonds causes the gluten to be both plastic and elastic. A material that is plastic deforms under pressure, that is, you can bend it without breaking it. A material that is elastic will return to its original shape once that pressure is removed. So as you knead dough, it will stretch when you push it, but then once you let go, it will at least mostly return to its original shape. The plasticity allows the bread dough to incorporate the bubbles produced in the leavening process, but the elasticity resists enough to keep the bubbles from breaking through and escaping as they might in a thinner batter like the pancakes that we talked about last time. The plasticity is due to the gliadins acting like ball bearings, allowing the glutenin chains to slide past each other. And the elasticity is provided by the coiled glutenin chains. They can be unwound with pressure, but will rewind, similar to how a coiled metal spring or slinky lengthens and contracts with changing force. Again, this elasticity causes stretched dough to slowly creep back towards its original shape. Now, unlike the coiled metal spring, the gluten elasticity relaxes over time. A well-developed, that is, a well-kneaded, dough has the glutenin chains aligned in the same direction with many weak bonds between them. This causes the dough to be relatively firm. But because the bonds are weak and are constantly being broken and reformed, they allow the gluten chains to slowly slide past one another over time, and this then allows the dough to gradually relax into a flatter shape if left alone. Now, in some foods, we want a strong, elastic gluten. These foods include yeasted breads, bagels, and puff pastries. But in other foods, we want tender, easily separated gluten proteins. These include raised cakes, griddle cakes like pancakes, and cookies. So we need to be able to control the strength of the gluten network. We can do this in a number of different ways. One way is by choosing the flour. High-protein flours will produce a strong gluten network, whereas low-protein flours like pastry and cake flour will produce a weak gluten network. That is, the higher the concentration of gluten in the dough, the stronger the gluten network will be. Durum semolina is a flour used for pasta as it produces a strong but plastic gluten network. We can also control the strength of the gluten network using the presence or absence of oxidizing substances. Oxidizers increase the end-to-end linking of glutenin chains. With longer chains, longer sections of the network are bound together, so the gluten network is stronger. We can also vary the water content. Less water gives an incompletely developed gluten network with a crumbly texture. That is, there's so little water that the gluten chains can't slide past one another enough to form sufficient bonds for a strong gluten network to form. If we add a little too much water, the gluten proteins will get diluted and will have a weak gluten network. However, we'll still have a dough, it'll just be soft and moist and largely unable to hold its shape. If we add even more water, the gluten proteins are now so dilute that we have a batter rather than a dough, and the gluten network will be quite weak. We need to develop the gluten network by stirring or kneading. Remember that this aligns the glutenin chains and allows the formation of the chemical bonds between neighboring chains to form the gluten network. If we knead too little, we will have a weak gluten network. On the other hand, if we knead too long, we will overdevelop the gluten network and begin breaking down the glutenin chains. We've seen previously how adding acid can alter the charge on the surface of the proteins. In the case of gluten proteins, adding the acid causes them to acquire a positive charge, which tends to repel other protein chains. This then interferes with the formation of bonds between the neighboring glutenin chains and results in a weaker gluten network. On the other hand, adding salt can strengthen the gluten network. Table salt is sodium chloride, which is made up of positively charged sodium ions and negatively charged chloride ions. These ions can effectively cancel the oppositely charged portions of the proteins, making them appear to neighboring proteins as neutrally charged. This then allows the proteins to get closer together and form more chemical bonds. Likewise, calcium and magnesium ions can bind to two neighboring proteins, which significantly increases the strength of the network. We can add calcium and magnesium ions either through hard water or through the use of sea salt, which is mostly sodium chloride but does contain some other ions such as calcium and magnesium. If we add sugar, those sugar molecules will dilute the gluten proteins to cause a weaker gluten network. And if we add fats or oils, they tend to coat the outer surfaces of those gluten proteins, interfering in the bonds between the neighboring proteins, which then weakens the gluten. In fact, in cooking, fats and oils are often called shortening because they weaken the gluten structure and therefore shorten the dough. Now, we've talked a lot about the gluten proteins because they're quite important for the structure of our dough, but they only account for about 10% of the mass of the flour. Starches account for the majority at about 70% of the mass, so they're far more abundant. This is important because these starch granules serve to dilute the gluten proteins enough to prevent the dough from becoming too stiff. Remember that when baked, the starch granules absorb water and their outsides swell and become gel-like. This allows them to be sticky but still somewhat flexible. In a cake, the water and sugar dilute the gluten so much that the gluten network is quite weak and the majority of the structure of the cake is due to these gelated starch granules. This means that it takes very little effort to chew a cake, as those starch granules are only held together by their very weak, gel-like exteriors. This starch structure exists in breads too, but the gluten network is stronger, and so the strength of the starch structure is much less important. As we bake a loaf of bread, the starch granules absorb water and stick together into a moist, flexible solid. This prevents the walls of dough surrounding the bubbles of carbon dioxide and water vapor from expanding any further. As the water vapor expands from the heat, it must then force its way through the dough walls to escape. This causes the tiny individual bubbles to become an interconnected network similar to a sponge. The escape of the water vapor, the steam, is a good thing. If it didn't escape by breaking through the dough walls, then it would remain trapped inside the bubbles. When the bread cools, the steam would condense back into a liquid. This would cause two things. The first is that the bread would become overly moist, and the second is that as the water vapor condenses, the volume of gas trapped in the bubbles would drop. As the volume of gas drops, the bubbles would shrink, which would cause the bread to collapse and become rather dense. If you've ever baked a cake and it collapsed after being removed from the oven, this is what happened. Now, we've talked a good bit about the production of carbon dioxide in the leavening process and steam during the baking, but these gases do not cause additional bubbles to form during the baking process. Rather, as these gases are produced, they migrate to pre-existing bubbles of gas already trapped in the dough. Those gas bubbles are largely the result of small air bubbles trapped in the dough during the kneading process of the dough or of the whipping of certain ingredients such as eggs, butter, and sugar. The more tiny air bubbles incorporated during the whipping or kneading processes, the more bubbles will be in the resulting bread or cake. And that means that each individual bubble in the baked good will be smaller, resulting in a more tender structure. We mentioned earlier that we could choose different types of flour. Those different flours are from different strains of wheat plants that evolved to produce different amounts of gluten protein. While different flours are useful for different purposes, it means that replacing one flour with another will often result in a subpar baked good, whether that means a too strong or a too weak gluten network, depending upon what you're baking. Bread flours have more protein than do all-purpose flours. This means that they'll require more kneading to develop a strong gluten network, but they'll produce a well-raised bread that has a slightly eggy flavor and a chewy texture. On the other hand, all-purpose flour will produce a bread with a smaller volume, a more neutral flavor, and a less chewy texture. Flour from softer wheats than all-purpose flour will produce an even weaker gluten network and a denser loaf with a more cake-like crumb. At its simplest, baking bread requires 4 steps: mixing the ingredients, kneading the dough, leavening, and baking. The 4 main ingredients are water, flour, yeast, and salt. Kneading the dough develops the gluten network that provides the majority of the structure of our baked loaf. The leavening requires time for the yeast to produce carbon dioxide from the sugars in the flour, although this step could be combined with the baking step if you're using a chemical leavener. And finally, the dough needs to be heated to permanently set the structure and allow energy for the Maillard reactions to develop further flavors via reactions between the amino acids and the sugars. When you're measuring the ingredients, most American recipes measure using volume, such as cups, tablespoons, or teaspoons. Measuring in this way is generally fine for liquids like water, but when measuring solids like flour or sugar, air pockets or small changes in density, such as whether or not the flour has been sifted, can make a significant difference. So it's best to measure solids using mass or weight rather than volume. As we've already discussed, the proportion of water to flour matters quite a bit. 65 parts of water to 100 parts all-purpose flour will give a firm dough capable of trapping the bubbles produced during leavening. If you have a higher protein bread flour, you'll need up to a third more water, or up to about 85 parts water. Using a little less water will produce a firmer, less plastic dough that produces a denser loaf, while a little more water will produce a softer, less elastic dough that produces a lighter, more open-textured loaf. Adding salt can help strengthen the gluten network and help increase the volume of the loaf, particularly if we add sea salt that contains the cross-linking calcium and magnesium ions. Furthermore, salt added to sourdough limits the protein digesting activity of the souring bacteria, which prevents damage to the gluten network. The yeasts that provide the leavening come in many different strains and a variety of different forms. In general, a better tasting loaf is produced by adding less yeast and allowing it to work for longer to leaven the loaf. This is because we can taste the yeast cells themselves, and they don't taste particularly good. So reducing how many cells there are reduces this effect, while lengthening the time that they have allows them to produce the same amount of carbon dioxide and other products. Again, the fermentation reaction doesn't only produce carbon dioxide. The yeasts also produce a variety of other waste products, and those products go on to react with a variety of other compounds in the dough during the baking process. The result is that a yeast-leavened loaf will taste significantly better than a chemically leavened loaf. As soon as the flour and water are mixed, the broken starch granules start to absorb water and enzymes begin to digest the exposed starches into simpler sugars. The yeast feeds on these sugars, producing carbon dioxide and alcohol. The glutenin proteins absorb some of the water and begin forming weak bonds with one another. And finally, as we continue stirring, oxygen from the air along with other oxidizing groups react with the sulfur groups at the end of the glutenin chains. This allows them to form end-to-end bonds with other glutenin chains, strengthening the gluten network. Next up is the kneading process, during which we'll develop the gluten network by repeatedly stretching, folding over, and compressing the dough. Many bakers prefer to do this by hand so that they can feel how the dough changes and develop the gluten network to just the right amount. Other bakers prefer to save the effort and use an electric mixer. Either way works fine, so if you don't have an electric mixer, you can still make this week's recipe just fine. Your arms may just be a little bit sore afterwards. The kneading process unfolds the gluten proteins, orients the glutenin chains in the same direction via the repeated stretching, and encourages the development of the weak bonds between the neighboring chains. As the bonds continue to form, the gluten network becomes stronger and stiffer, which makes kneading more difficult. If over-kneaded, as can happen in an electric mixer, the end-to-end bonds between the chains begin to break down, resulting in a dough that's sticky and inelastic. This is pretty unlikely to happen if you're kneading by hand, as you're fairly likely to tire out long before getting to this point. But if you do use an electric mixer, be sure to stop the mixer and check the elasticity periodically, at least until you've made a recipe a few times and know how long to let the mixer knead. Again, in addition to developing the gluten network, the kneading process also helps trap those primordial air bubbles that the carbon dioxide and water vapor will later join during the baking process. If you incorporate fewer air bubbles, you'll end up with fewer bubbles that are much larger, leading to a loaf like the one on the left. On the other hand, if you incorporate more air bubbles, you'll end up with many more bubbles that are much smaller and more evenly distributed, leading to a loaf like the one on the right. Note that if you're baking a cake and the recipe instructs you to beat or whip eggs prior to adding flour and sugar, this is a large part of what you're doing, trapping air bubbles in the liquidy egg for the carbon dioxide to diffuse into during the bake so that you end up with lots of well-distributed bubbles in your cake sponge. During the fermentation process, the yeast produces carbon dioxide and the dough expands. That is, it rises. Again, though, the yeast also produce a variety of other waste products that improve the flavor of the bread and also oxidize the glutenin proteins, serving to strengthen the gluten network. Now, like all organisms, the yeast ferment best at a relatively narrow range of temperatures. They produce carbon dioxide the fastest at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, but they'll also produce more sour, that is acidic, and other unpleasant smelling byproducts. If we lower the temperature a little to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the yeast provides enough carbon dioxide to get a good rise in about 2 hours, while producing fewer of the unpleasant byproducts. If we lower the temperature range even more, to room temperature, we'll get even more pleasant byproducts and fewer unpleasant ones. But of course, we'll need to give the yeast longer to work. Whatever temperature we allow the fermentation to occur at, it's complete when the dough volume has doubled and when the gluten matrix has lost its elasticity. If you poke the dough and your finger impression remains, that is, if the dough doesn't spring back, you can stop the fermentation. During the fermentation process, the yeast produce heat, water, and alcohol in addition to the carbon dioxide that leavens the dough. The combination of the extra water and the gas bubbles make the gluten feel softer and easier to work with. At this point, we rework the dough with a second kneading process to evenly distribute those yeast cells, gas bubbles, and gluten. We then form the dough into a ball, allowing it to relax some into a somewhat flatter shape, then form it into a loaf. We'll often allow the loaf to rise a little bit more before baking to set the structure. Traditionally, bread making took many hours, and so a professional baker would have to work through the night to have freshly baked loaves to sell in the morning. However, starting in the 1920s, bakers began splitting the work into two parts: the daytime work of mixing, fermenting, and molding into loaves, and then the early morning baking. I want you to pause the video and take a moment to think about why bakers began doing this in the 1920s. That is, what happened around this time to allow the bakers to split the process in this way that wasn't available to them earlier. In order to have hours pass between the molding of the loaves and the baking, the yeast needs to be prevented from continuing to work away at the sugars and continuing the fermentation process. The baker only has two real options. The first is to kill the yeast, which would require either baking the bread or adding enough salt to kill the yeast. However, this much salt would also make the resulting loaf far too salty to be pleasant. The second option is to slow down the fermentation process dramatically by reducing the temperature to just above freezing. It's around this time that refrigeration becomes commonplace in a commercial setting, and bakers use it to improve their working conditions by slowing down the fermentation process and allowing them to postpone the baking of the loaves. Note also that colder dough is stiffer than warm dough, and so it helps to keep the leavening gas in the dough while being worked. As we saw earlier, traditional bread ovens were clay, stone, or brick ovens that were preheated using a wood fire. The walls of the oven stored the heat, the ashes were then removed, the loaves placed in the oven, and the door was closed. This means that the oven surfaces start out quite warm at between 700 and 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and then slowly cool as they radiate heat to the dough. The dough then initially heats quite quickly, encouraging expansion as the gas bubbles expand with a higher temperature. But then the crust dries out, stiffens, and begins to undergo the browning reactions that produce the flavors we love in baked goods. However, because the air is trapped inside the oven, the water that evaporates into steam is also trapped inside. This tends to make the oven quite humid, preventing the loaf from becoming overly dry. However, it also increases the rate at which the loaf heats because steam conducts heat much faster than dry air. The increased heating rate, coupled with the condensation of water onto the relatively cold surface of the dough, allows the dough to rise faster before the crust dries and stiffens, which then prevents further expansion. As a result, bread baked in a steamy atmosphere forms a lighter, larger loaf. By lighter here, I mean less dense, not lighter in color. In fact, due to the increased heating of the crust, the loaf would have a darker color as more of the browning reactions occur. However, most of us don't have a brick or stone oven at home. Instead, we have a modern metal oven with a maximum temperature of 500 degrees Fahrenheit and a relatively thin metal wall that can't retain the heat as well as the thick brick or stone walls of a traditional wood-fired oven. So our modern gas oven must continue to burn natural gas to keep the oven hot. But those exhaust gases must be vented out of the oven, and the steam from the dough escapes with them. Furthermore, as the fire turns on and off, the temperature fluctuates. An electric oven can do a somewhat better job of maintaining the temperature by increasing the duty cycle and doesn't need to be vented, so it can trap more of the steam. However, I have an electric oven at home, and my oven has a fan that constantly exhausts air from the oven, so even an electric oven isn't ideal, as you will still lose some of the steam. All is not lost, however, as you can approximate the steam produced in a traditional oven by spraying water or throwing a few ice cubes into the oven when you first add the loaf. Of course, you also want to avoid opening the door to avoid letting any of the steam or heat out. Some home bakers also choose to add bricks or other stones inside their ovens in an attempt to retain additional heat. After you've baked your bread, it'll stay tasty for a few days, but it will eventually stale. The bread gets hard, dry, and crumbly. You might have thought that your bread has dried out, and that has caused it to stale, but you'd be wrong. In fact, even if we place the bread into a hermetically sealed container to avoid any moisture loss, the bread will still stale. You can observe this process occurring with bread inside a plastic bag. Water vapor can't get out, but the bread stales anyway. If we heat the bread to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, we can reverse the staling process, and the bread appears to be almost as fresh as when it was first baked. We now know that those starch granules that we spoke about earlier gelate at this temperature. It turns out that the staling of bread is the reversal of the hydration of the starch granules. The starch recrystallizes, pushing the water out of the granule and hardening the starch granule. This causes the bread to lose its flexibility. If we heat the bread up again, the starch granule rehydrates as water is reabsorbed, and this bread becomes flexible once more. Note that when we toast bread, the interior of the bread is soft due to this rehydration of the starch granules. Of course, the outer surface of the bread has been toasted to a much higher temperature, and so it becomes less flexible as much of the water in that outer layer is evaporated, and the starches and gluten network in that outer layer undergo browning reactions, and will eventually burn if you leave the toast in long enough. Because of the staling process, you should not store your bread in the refrigerator. The staling process occurs more rapidly as the temperature gets farther from 140 degrees Fahrenheit, so it will happen quite quickly in the fridge. However, once you freeze the water, it can't migrate out of the starch granule, so freezing the bread will virtually stop the staling process. If you're going to eat the bread within a few days, store it at room temperature in a bread box or paper bag. A plastic bag will trap moisture that is leaving the starch granules and thereby encourage mold growth. If you're going to take longer than a few days before eating the bread, you're best off wrapping it in plastic to prevent sublimation of water and putting it in the freezer.